Hello class, Miss Jen here, Chapter 12, Lesson 2. It's titled Conflicts Over Land. We have a little quiz at the end, and it's Current Event Thursday. Let's get into it. So, you can probably tell I love the United States. I also love American history. Teaching is a pleasure, and I enjoy making these lessons for you. But loving one's country, like loving a person, means accepting both the good and the bad. So our nation's history is full of proud moments, great things that we've done, but there are also some things in there you have to look back and say, yeah, that was a jerk move. You have to take the good with the bad and learn the bad so that we don't do it again. Today we talk about some things specifically involving Native Americans that highlight some of our not so great moments. Let's get into it. So as America moved west, there was still a great number of Indian tribes that remained in the east. They were mainly in the south, tribes like the Seminole and the Cherokee. There were 5 tribes that had basically formed up into farming villages like every other American, just like we wanted them to. And these were called the 5 civilized tribes. Americans recognized the success of these tribes and their adoption of the American way of life, but they still didn't really respect them. They were still like a lower class of society. In fact, they just kind of really wanted their land. Many folks wanted the government to relocate the natives further west. When elected, Andrew Jackson supported the idea of relocating those natives into the Great Plains, a place believed to be a wasteland where no American would ever want to live. It was believed this relocation would end all the Indian conflicts once and for all. Remember, Indian conflicts have been a problem throughout the history of, well, the colonies, back to colonial days. Starting, I guess, with King Philip's War, we learned about way back in our first chapter. On the topic of the Great Plains, we're going to learn about those a little later in the year and what new inventions basically lead us to be able to farm the Great Plains, which are now called America's breadbasket. So, yeah, growing can be done there, but not yet. Okay, in 1830, President Jackson made a law through Congress. He pushed it through Congress, called the Indian Removal Act. Sort of famous. This allowed the USA to pay Indians to move west. In 1834, Congress set up a huge Indian reserve in what would become Oklahoma. Most natives felt forced to comply and moved west, but the Cherokee, they did not. The Cherokee ended up taking the state of Georgia to the Supreme Court. So the Cherokee versus the government of Georgia. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, actually sided with the Cherokee, citing previous treaties made with the natives. But Andrew Jackson simply refused to enforce the treaty and basically ignored the court. The court has no power to execute the laws and enforce the laws because that's the president's job. So if the president doesn't do that, there's nothing Congress can do about it. Basically, Jackson really wanted to see those natives moved to make the people happy. Now, that leads us into sort of one of the dark pages of U.S. history, the Trail of Tears. There would be more problems for the Cherokee. In 1835, the federal government convinced a small group of Cherokee to sign a treaty giving up all Cherokee claims by the year 1838. The problem is this group of Cherokee was it was represented 500 Cherokee of the 17,000 Cherokee natives, so a very small subsection. But Jackson used this trickery to get the treaty officially approved by the Senate in 1836. So it's approved now. But it only passed by one vote because a lot of legislators realized that this was like some tomfoolery, some tricky that had occurred, and that these natives didn't represent all the Cherokee. Regardless, it did pass, and when the deadline was reached in 1838, by this time, Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, enforced the treaty by sending federal troops to basically force the Cherokee to move west. Now, some 15,000 Cherokee were rounded up. Many were not ready for the journey. They were either really old, really young, or sick. Illness spread through these camps. There was not enough food, and conditions were harsh. By the time this forced relocation was over, a quarter of the Cherokee population had died. This journey is now referred to as the Trail of Tears. Let's talk about some resistance to the removal. Only one group of natives were successful in resisting removal, and that was the Seminole of Florida. In 1835, a group of soldiers went down to Florida to remove the Seminole as they had the Cherokee, and instead of being able to move them, they were attacked. And those U.S. troops were actually killed pretty much down to the last man. The leader of the Seminole was a man named Osceola. There he is. Now, between 1835 and 1842, about 3,000 Seminole and Black Seminoles fought roughly 30,000 U.S. troops. What's a Black Seminole, Mr. Young? Those are actually escaped slaves that escaped down into Florida and lived with the Seminole Indians. They basically were going to fight to the death because they were not going back to a life of slavery. The war, the Seminole Wars, they cost many lives, and the U.S. spent a great deal of money down there. It was a money pit. The Seminole used hit-and-run tactics, kind of coming up into settlements in Florida, hitting them, and then running away again. By 1842, however, most of the Seminole had been forced into Indian territories. War broke out again in 1855, with the few remaining Seminole left in Florida, and it's said that the last of the Seminole hid in the Everglades, where their descendants still live today. So, well, I guess when you get down to it, not all the Seminole were removed after all. Real quickly, life in the West. The 5 civilized tribes were relocated to Mississippi and placed on lands already claimed by other tribes. To avoid any problems involving turf wars, the U.S. Army built forts in the area to basically keep the peace, sort of a policing action. The Choctaw tribe had their own police fort called the Light Horsemen, which are pretty cool when you read about them. They're basically their own sort of self-policing police force. Check out the link for the skinny on the Light Horseman. It's pretty cool. There should be a movie about it. The civilized tribes rebuilt their farms, schools, and homes. They wrote constitutions and law. All was not well, though, as problems associated with their forced removal would continue to arise. We're going to have problems all throughout, really, all the history of the United States. All right, you have a quiz up next. And then you have a current event Thursday. Read on anything you want. Yep, basic quiz. That's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know. There's a lot of opportunities to look up other things. There's a lot more information out there about the Trail of Tears and the Light Horsemen and the Indian Removal Act and the Seminole Wars. A lot of interesting subjects we hit today, very briefly. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a good day, and don't forget to do your article.